Welcome into another edition of the Musketeer Report Podcast. Today is January 13th, 2025. Xavier is ranked 53rd in KenPom. They are 10-7 overall, 2-4 in Big East play. They lost at Georgetown and at home to St. John's, then picked up a win at DePaul, 77-63 on Saturday afternoon. So that kind of gets you caught up to speed since the last time we talked. Paul Fritschner is back. He's been on the road. He's been traveling. He's been making a documentary, doing all types of things. Paul, Happy New Year to you. Thanks for joining us. We're going to start with this DePaul game, which you were at. And after the St. John's loss, Sean Miller called out his team's effort. It seemed like, based on what we saw in the DePaul game, the team responded well to that, given their 77-63 win, that knockout punch they threw at the end of the first half, the way they kept the foot on the gas there through that middle part of the second half when DePaul tried to make a little run to get back into it. Was that your overall takeaway from the game? Was the team kind of bounced back and responded to Sean Miller challenging them?
Yeah, absolutely. He wanted more effort. He wanted more defensive intensity. He wanted better rebounding. He wanted all of the things that we've talked about for so long on here that didn't show up against St. John's. Look, they got punked against St. John's. I think the best example of that was that one play. I don't know if it was a 2 or a 3. It doesn't matter. But that rebound that bounced right in the middle of probably 3 or 4 different Xavier players that nobody just leaned down and grabbed. A St. John's player got it, laid it right up and in, and that was kind of the epitome of that entire game. And you go away from that game and you think, okay, this season could really go one of two ways. Either you go on the road and lose at DePaul and things just completely spiral out of control, or you respond to that and you respond to your coach and you win at DePaul. And I think they did exactly that. It was the latter. Look, DePaul, they shot well for the first 8 or 9 minutes of the game, and they made a couple of threes in the last 2 or 3 minutes that cut it from 22 to 14. But overall, Xavier allowed 6 points in the last 10:47 of the first half, and that spoke more to what that effort was up in Chicago.
Yeah, that's what stood out to me, Paul, is you see that second half against St. John's where Sean Miller said it, so we don't have to go above and beyond. It didn't look like guys were trying at different points or trying enough. It didn't look like they were matching the level of effort of St. John's. He called them out on that, which when you get to that point of the season, then people start doing. We saw it on the message board, have they lost the locker room? Are guys focused on other things? Are they worried about themselves? All those types of things start coming up when you start questioning the effort of your team. And I think what the DePaul game showed us is none of that has happened. This group is still fighting. They're still battling back. They still responded to their coach. They're still playing playing for one another and playing together. I mean, that stretch that they ended the first half on, that 21-3 run at DePaul, on Wednesday night, if you wake up as a Xavier fan on Thursday and you're thinking about this team, you don't think that's a remote possibility for this group after watching Wednesday night's performance. So to see that stark contrast, and yes, I know DePaul is not nearly as good as St. John's and some of the other teams in the conference, but regardless of who they were playing, I didn't think they were capable of a run like they put on the end of that first half at DePaul.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing, too, with that was it was nice to see guys like Ryan Conwell kind of get back into the mix. Zach Fremantle didn't start the game, but he led the team with 20 points, 10 rebounds. Conwell had really struggled over the last couple of games shooting the ball. And then I thought he got to the free throw line. He got fouled on a couple of threes. He got to the free throw line. He went 7 for 7 from the free throw line. And then he had a couple of threes. He finished 2 for 7, but that was because he had started off the game a little cold. And then he got a little warmer and back into it.
Let me ask you about that. Do you think that could be a sign of things to come for him, that maybe he's realizing I can pick my spots a little bit better of when to be aggressive, when to try to catch a guy on a bad closeout off guard and get into the lane and maybe draw a foul or finish at the rim, use one of those seal actions that they like to do within their offense where he did in the second half, got to the rim unimpeded and was able to lay it in. Do you think that's a sign of things to come, or do you think this was a good matchup because DePaul wasn't very athletic and he was actually able to beat some guys off the dribble?
No, I think, well, there's part of that, of course. But I think overall, he'd been in a slump. And for as good of a shooter as he is, for as talented of a shooter as he is, guys go through this. They don't shoot at that level. Your best shooter doesn't become your best shooter every single game, night in and night out, I mean, the other night, Trey Robinson, the other night for NKU from your perspective. I'm just saying, your best players sometimes have off nights. And I think we thought Ryan would be a little more consistent at different points here over the last couple of weeks. But even still, I was never concerned about him. I think there was a little more concern maybe in the the message board and the fan base and everything else than I ever really had about Ryan, because I see what he does, whether it's in practice or before the game, warm-ups, whatever. And I know it's way different when you're shooting with nobody in front of you than it is when you're playing at game pace and everything else. But still, I never really was super concerned about his shooting. And I know the 2 for 7 number, just the optics of that aren't great, but I do think that him now making a couple and having a stretch here where you're playing some more guard-oriented teams, like you're going to play, Villanova, who I know their best player is a forward, but still you have kind of maybe a
Luka
smaller
Poplar,
team. Yeah, Luka Poplar, Jameer Brickus, those guys, a smaller lineup. It's a little different now here going forward. You have Creighton here coming up in the mix. Of course, you have Marquette, who Xavier, took right down to the wire a couple of weeks ago. So all of that is to say that I think Ryan, I would hope at least, seeing the ball go in, like sometimes it's just nice to see one go in and to be able to get to the line, to get a few actions that get you to the hoop, but then also to take more selective shots and step into it. He's going to take open threes, and they're not going to tell him to stop shooting, and eventually it's going to start to fall maybe a little more consistently than 2 for 7.
They play Villanova next. Villanova is an interesting team this year because they started off the way they did. They struggled in their MT, and everyone was already like, this is the end for Kyle Neptune. What a disaster. What a horrible final season for Eric Dixon, all of these types of things. And then they started turning around. They won a big game or two recently, and now people are kind of going the other way of like, what a turnaround for this Villanova team. My question is, you look at them, they're 11-6 overall, 4-2 in Big East play. Their big wins right now are basically UC and UConn at home. And those are good wins to have, I think. But my question for you is, are you buying that this Villanova team is much improved, or do you think they're a desperate team, a really good player in Eric Dixon, a really desperate coach who's fighting for his job, and they were able to pull off 1 or 2 big wins here?
I do think they're much better. I think the jury is still out on whether this is like an NCAA tournament team or not, because I think that's the way that the public perception of Villanova right now is trending. And I have definitely fallen susceptible a little bit to that here in the last week watching them play. But what we expected Villanova to be coming into the season, and they had kind of gone to the portal, and there was Eric Dixon, and then who else? Well, for a lot of the season, that's still been how it is. I mean, if you think back to that game where they beat Cincinnati, it was basically Dixon. Jameer Brickus had a decent game, but there was nobody else. They picked up a win last week, and I don't have their schedule in front of me. Who did they just beat before St. John's?
UConn at home, is that the one you're talking about?
Was that? Yeah, okay. Yes, that I believe it was that game. I think maybe Eric Dixon didn't have a great game in that one, but the supporting cast did. I could be speaking up a wall on that one. There was a game that they played recently, and this is what I get for
UConn, DePaul, and Butler were their last 3 wins right before the St. John's game. So
okay.
UConn was the most recent one.
Gotcha. Well, there was one game in that stretch where basically the defensive identity was let's shut down, because you can do one of two things. You can either say Eric Dixon's going to score 50 and everybody else is going to score 5, right, and we're going to try and win this game like that, or it's we're going to throw everything at Eric Dixon and make everybody else beat us. From that perspective, it's like what do you decide to do? I'm very, very interested to see what Xavier does defensively tomorrow night against Eric Dixon, because he is having a National Player of the Year caliber season, and I know that Villanova isn't good enough for him to win that award this year, but the scoring that he is doing and the load that he is having to maintain for this Villanova team to even be as good as they are, whether you think they're great or not, for them to even be relevant in this for us to have this conversation, it's taken Eric Dixon having the season that he's having, which is maybe his best season yet.
Yeah, I look at their schedule, and it's like, they had the losses to Columbia, St. Joe's, and Virginia early. Columbia, Virginia, both outside the top 100. St. Joe's just barely inside the top 100. You lose to Maryland, whatever. Maryland's pretty good. Then a loss at Creighton, no big deal. But the wins that they're getting credit for, again, are a Cincinnati win, which came at home. And I think we're seeing Cincinnati, they scored 60 points in that game. That's who Cincinnati is. They really struggle to score, especially if they're away from Fifth Third Arena. And then the UConn game, that's a great win for them. But right now it feels like that's doing a lot of lifting for all the positive vibes around this Villanova team. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I'm not fully convinced that this is going to be as difficult of a game as people are talking it up to be for Xavier. I think this is very much a winnable game for Xavier at home.
I do think it's a winnable game at home for Xavier, and I think you and I, when we talk about what this season can be, and you've talked a lot about trying to look at specific things the rest of the way and what Xavier can build on. If you're looking at this from a perspective of a fan that wants to see Xavier make the NCAA tournament this season, I mean, if you look at the next 7 games for Xavier versus their final 7 games, Xavier has 14 regular season games remaining. All of their quad one opportunities come in the next 3 weeks in these next 7 games. So if Xavier wants to make anything of this season, they need to start winning games now if they want to even have a thought of climbing back into that conversation. That here tomorrow night, this feels like, to me, in this season, if this team does want to respond and make anything of it and have a good chance at home, the students are back. I think Sean talked about that after the game and how fired up he is to see this crowd tomorrow night and wants a great crowd to be behind this team and everything else tomorrow night at Cintas. This is a massive chance for Xavier to show that they're maybe moving in the right direction, or we'll see.
Yeah, this stretch, the 4-game stretch after Villanova, because I think Villanova is, like I said, very much a winnable game.
Yeah.
After that, it gets really, really difficult for this team with the way they've been playing. You're at Marquette, you're at St. John's, which seems to be the most difficult matchup for them in the conference this year. Then you have UConn at home, and you're at Creighton. So all of those are big-time games, really big challenges. If you steal any of those, then I think it gives you some reason for positivity because, to your point, the last 9 games are all winnable. Villanova, the game at Villanova, is the only game where Ken Pom has it as an expected loss for Xavier. They're under 50% chance to win that game. Everything else is better than 50% for them to win the rest of the way, the other 8 of 9 games to end the season. So if you do start getting hot all of a sudden, there is the opportunity for them to rattle off some wins in the final few weeks.
And you can sit here and argue, you can talk on the message board, you can tweet at us, you can do whatever you want about whether you think this team is good enough to win those games or not. I'm not going to have that conversation. I'm simply going to talk about what they have in front of them metrics-wise, and it's the fact that, yeah, they're 0-7 this year in quad 1 games, but they're 10-0 in quads 2 through 4. And if you can just steal 2 or 3 of these quad 1 games, if they can do that, then all of a sudden you're talking about maybe rattling off some wins down the stretch of this season. And if they can do that, then the optics of everything become a whole lot different. So are they good enough to do that? Do the shots fall? Is the offense there enough to win a couple of these games over the next 2 weeks to where they could put themselves in position to have a conversation like that in late February? That's what it's going to take. It's a hot stretch here. And by hot stretch, I mean in the next 7 games, they could go 2-5 or 3-4, but if 2 or 3 of those wins are quad 1 wins, then at least it's something to be able to write home about.
Paul, I'll let you go with this. Is there a guy on this roster that you're still holding out hope for, that you think there's something left in there? We're going to see more of him before the end of the season is over?
I still think it's Dante Maddox.
That's my guy too.
I still do because, I think we're seeing with John Hughley, he's seen stretches of minutes here and there, but I think by this point we kind of know what we're seeing out of John Hughley. What I would like to see with Dante Maddox more is the shot selection. I don't mind him shooting a lot. It's the selection that at some points, there was a shot from the right wing the other day where he caught the ball, and I think if he'd have gone right up with it, it'd have been contested. But he took one dribble to his left, and it was way more contested than it would have been if he would have just gone straight up off the catch. That it's those little things that the shot selection into the second half of the season, you can improve that and start to hit a few more. I mean, it's been a slow process for Dante, but I still think there's something left in there that we haven't seen yet, that if he can click it, it'll make a big difference.
I agree. And I think when you go back to what's given them the most trouble which is those defenses that are essentially trying to shut down their ball movement and their flow offense and get them to play one-on-one and go by them. Like, we don't believe you guys have enough athletes to drive by us and make us pay consistently for over-pressuring you. That's what's given them the most trouble. To me, it feels like Dante Maddox is one of the guys that has the best chance to give you an option in those situations because he is so confident and he does have the ability to just like catch the ball, take a dribble, and fire up a three, and he's dangerous when he does that. So I'm not saying it's going to work out. I'm not saying his shot selection hasn't been questionable, because it has at times, but it just feels like if he can get right and get confidence and they can give him a little bit more playing time consistently, and they've started to, then maybe he can still unlock something there going forward the rest of the season. Paul, really appreciate you giving us some time. I know you're really busy right now, but thank you for your insights as always.
Appreciate it, Rick. Thanks for having me on. See everybody tomorrow night. I'm really looking forward to it.
All right, good stuff there from Paul Fritschner. Appreciate him catching up with us as always. I want to keep talking a little bit about some of the fallout from the St. John's loss, because I think it seemed like there was some expectation from some fans that I do something more after that. Like, I know people went like, I get some people live and die with every game, and it's like every game is a new world, and they need an overreaction every time. They need tantrums or whatever. I don't think everyone is in that boat. It's like there's no context the rest of the season for them. They go into every game as a completely new season, and if the team plays bad, then they need to hear that after every game. Like, yeah, they're probably not going to make an NCAA tournament this year. That's what I've been saying for a few weeks now. For others, I think it was just the reality of how bad the team looked in that St. John's game was eye-opening, and maybe they didn't want to believe what I was saying before, didn't agree with me before, but now they did. And so maybe that's where some of that sentiment was coming from, that like we talk about it more or freak out about it more. I don't know. But I didn't think, I thought it was kind of par for the course. If you look at St. John's, they're just a really difficult matchup for Xavier. And I think it became clear in that game that this Xavier team's biggest issue is its lack of athleticism. We've talked about that throughout the year. We've known that's been the case. But when you saw it in that St. John's game, and it was such a focus, especially as they're crushing them on the offensive glass and just bullying them inside, I think that's where it really hit home that, okay, there are flaws with this team in a lot of areas, but the biggest one right now is just they do not have Big East level of athletes. And that, I think, if I was the coaching staff looking at the roster and looking at what's next and what do you have to do going forward, I think that would jump out to me after the St. John's performance. You know, Sean Miller in the second half questioned the team's effort. And I talked with Paul a little bit about that when that happens, you start questioning, is there more going on there? I hadn't heard anything. I know people were asking about that on the message board. I hadn't heard anything to suggest that there are other types of issues or that the guys aren't getting along or anything like that. I think they're just going through a difficult stretch and probably losing some confidence and probably feeling a bit demoralized in the second half of that St. John's game. And that's what led to their poor play in that game and maybe what was perceived as a lack of effort. And I think the DePaul game really quieted those sentiments. Anyone who was thinking that there was a riff in the locker room or something like that, it felt like that was pretty cleared up after the DePaul performance because they looked together. They had really good extended stretches throughout that game, and they played well defensively. They were tougher on the glass. It didn't look like a team that's quitting or a team that's fractured or any of that stuff. I mean, certainly a team that's battling through a tough stretch, but I don't think it's anything more than that at the moment. Moving past the St. John's game, just looking at the season more as a whole, one of the questions that I've gotten a few times is, what's the most concerning part of all this? If I believe that Xavier is not likely to get an at-large bid this year, and it feels like it's a second straight year of missing the NCAA tournament, what is the most concerning part about what's gone on this year? And maybe, related to the coaches or the roster building or any of that stuff, what do you view as the biggest issue? For me, it would start with 2 years of the roster not working. Or the style of roster building, I should say, not working. And this year's plan, which was different than the plan for a year ago, it didn't seem to set up next year for much success. Now, before we get any farther into that, let me just say, injuries are a huge caveat to all of this. When you put together a roster, and let's face it, in the NIL era where you're having to pay these guys, there's not a lot of room for error. You're not able to stack up a lot of depth. You're not able to get two guys at every position of need. you're going to have to rely on some guys that may have question marks, maybe coming back from injury like Xavier's had to do in multiple cases. Now, maybe they've over-relied on some of that, and that could certainly be in question, but it's kind of the hand they were dealt, right? You're not going to turn down a Zach Freemantle and a Jerome Hunter if they're already in your program and you know you can keep them versus having to go out and chase guys who may or may not be better than them while also paying them a lot of money. You knew what those guys had. So yes, there was an over-reliance on guys who were injured, but also that was kind of the hands that they were dealt with this roster because of Zach and Jerome more than anything. Now, the Lucina Traore injury, that's a freak injury. There's nothing you can do about that. There's nothing you can plan around that. John Hughley coming off an injury hasn't responded well. I think there's more to it than just the injury for him, but that was a bit of a risk, adding another guy who needed to bounce back. And it wasn't just an injury from last season that he needed to bounce back from. He hadn't really been a significant contributor in 2 seasons or more. So that was definitely a guy that had some baggage, had some question marks behind him, and you can have questions about how that worked out. But I do want to just say, if you put a plan together, a roster together, and then you lose starting members of your front court, 2 of them in 1 year, Lucina Traore this year, that's going to significantly change everything you planned on doing. In this case, this year, it's really changed the way Xavier runs its offense. They've ran a different style of offense with the 4 out, only 1 big on the floor, as opposed to the normal flow game with the 2 bigs that we've seen more often in previous seasons. Like, when everyone thinks of the new Sean Miller era at Xavier and when it was at its best, it was that first year with Jack Nunge and Zach Freemantle. And a lot of people think back to the way that flow offense looked with the playing through the middle of the third, the high-low actions between the 2 bigs, the big-to-big passing. All of that stuff really stands out. So again, when you lose your starting center and it takes away your ability to play that style of basketball, that's a major difference in what was going to happen this season. So I think we've put too much on Lucina Traore for what's expected out of him going into next year, what type of player he was going to be. But at the same time, I don't think some people are giving enough credit to how much that does impact your season when you lose a starting center like that, especially in Xavier's case where the backup option, or maybe you can even argue they were 1A and 1B and they were going to battle it out, the other guy who was in there to contend for that spot, John Hughley, has not panned out this year. So that's a big part of what's going on this year, no doubt about it. But if you want to go a little deeper, because I do think if you're Xavier staff, that's not the only problem right now. It's not just that Lucina Traore was injured, and it's probably not just that Jerome Hunter and Zach Freemantle were injured last year. Huge, significant plot points to the season, but not the only flaws with these rosters. I think one of the big questions that I would have right now is, are they sure of the type of guys they want? And what I mean by that is, I think of guys like Cam Kraft and Trey Green and Dante Maddox. And the reason I'm using those 3 players, and let me be clear, I realize they did not recruit Cam Kraft. That was Travis Steele's staff. He was already committed, signed. Once the coaching change happened, they convinced Cam Kraft to stay in the program, and maybe it wasn't a great fit from there. But they also asked him to come back a second season. So Kraft, Trey Green, Dante Maddox, all 3 of those guys, in my opinion, are talented offensive players that still have a lot of worth at the Division I level and could maybe even still succeed at the high major level. Now, there are questions about that, right? Like Cam Kraft has dropped down to the MAC, and he's playing very well. He's leading Miami in scoring, I believe, still, but that's a significant drop in the level of competition. Dante Maddox had already proven himself in the MAC. He's made the jump up. It hasn't worked out as well for him here in the Big East. Maybe it is just the jump up in level of competition for him, and we'll find out what happens with Trey Green. It could be a similar case, but all 3 of those guys, I believe, could give you something at this level on the offensive end, but they were always going to be offense-first players. And that's where I wonder if they were ever really great fits for this program, for this coaching staff. I wonder a little bit of, as they moved to this faster, up-tempo, higher-scoring model on the offensive end, did they start recruiting with that in mind, knowing they needed guys who played that way, who shot the ball well from the outside, but never fully being on board with what that meant about the type of players that they'd be getting? Some guys who were skilled, more finesse, maybe not as tough, maybe not as defensive-minded. I just don't know if Sean Miller and this staff are willing to trust guys that don't have that type of mentality. And again, maybe that's something where if you don't have that mentality at a certain level, you're just not going to be successful in the Big East. That could be the case with some of these guys, no doubt about it. But I also wonder if specifically with this program and with this staff, if they demand a little bit more when it comes to that. They want you to be a little bit tougher and a little bit better defensively for them to really trust you in their system. And if that's the case, then I'm not sure they ever should have brought some of these guys into the program, given the way it's turned out, because it just doesn't seem like they were willing to play many of them for extended stretches at all. Again, a lot of that's on the player. They're not cutting at this level. You got to win games. I fully understand all of that. But I do wonder how many roster spots have been spent on those skilled, offensive-minded type of guys that maybe they just weren't ever really going to fully trust. I would also wonder when you get into the transfer portal and it's moving really fast and you've got to do a ton of analysis and make really important decisions about your roster in a very short window, not just because the whole transfer portal happens quickly, but because the recruitment of each guy, like a guy goes into the portal and it might be 2 or 3 days and he's pretty much figured out what he's doing. That's not the case in every situation, but for some it is. So you're battling against the clock with other schools as well. I wonder if there can be, in some cases, a bit too much reliance on analytics in the portal. Meaning, a lot of these companies, the teams will subscribe to these companies that will put out an analytics rating for players. And it's very granular. It gets into lots of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's sort of like a Madden rating, right? You might subscribe to this company and they put out an overall rating for each player. And then I know some of the schools have done analysis on like, hey, any guy rated at this level or better really worked out well, or 98% of them worked out really well at our level of play. So those are the types of guys we're looking to recruit. Maybe when you get into all of that and you're looking at spreadsheets and you're looking at all of the analytics, I wonder if maybe it becomes too much of a Moneyball thing where you're just trying to put averages and percentages and points per possession together and not looking at the heart of the team, the soul of the team, the makeup of the team, and how it fits with your style and what you fully believe in. I think that might be what I would be evaluating the most if I was part of that staff and I was trying to look at what do we do differently going forward. That would be where I start, I think. And look, I'm sure this coaching staff is well aware of that. They know way more than I do, and they're probably doing much deeper analysis and looking inward than that. But if you're asking me, that would be my biggest thing. Final thing I'll wrap up the show with is what are we watching for the rest of the way aside from a miracle turnaround? If you are on board with me and you believe, this team isn't going to make an at-large bid in the NCAA tournament, then what are we watching for the rest of the season? What's most important in these games? And I think there are just so many important things to learn about this roster before getting into the transfer portal and the offseason again. The biggest focus is going to be on Conwell, Hughley, Swain, and Fletcher. And because those are the main guys that you have coming back for next year that could play a role. For Conwell and Swain, it's what are they worth? How much do you need to put around those guys? What can you pay them? How much can you base next year around them? And what else do you need to put around them? And that will all go into the decision about what are they doing? Are they coming back? What role do they have on next year's team? All of those things will be decided, I think, in the next several weeks as you watch the rest of the season and kind of see where they're at and you get a better feel for how much do we want to build around those two guys and are they on board with that going forward? How comfortable are they being the focal points of next year's roster if that's what you decide to do? And are they capable of doing that? And then with Fletcher and Hughley, it's more like, can they help you at all next season with more time in the program? You brought them in with the understanding that maybe the first semester was going to be a bit of a waste, but especially with Hughley, you were hopefully going to get more out of him as the season wore on and you got into the second half of the year. With Fletcher, you were hoping he was going to become more ready to play by the second half of the year. Fletcher, it doesn't seem like they're too interested in playing at all right now, just from a competitive standpoint. And then Hughley, he obviously really hasn't gotten into the mix much. He's started to play a little bit better recently, but still not a guy they're relying on for significant minutes or in important parts of the game, really. So I'm curious to see where that goes from here. Do you gain more confidence in those guys that you're bringing them back next year? Or even if you bring them back next year, what else do you need to bring in with them? Because I can't imagine, at least right now, based on the way things have gone, that you want to rely too heavily on either one of those guys. So those are my thoughts coming out of the last week of Xavier basketball. Of course, the loss at St. John's and then the win at DePaul. They have a game against Villanova at home tomorrow night, a big one for them to prove that this DePaul game was not just them playing against a team that's much less talented and a team that's really struggling and a team that has all the same weaknesses as them, but maybe just even worse so. I think this Villanova game, if they can play that way again and pull off a win at home, it'll definitely go a long way towards making fans feel a bit better about the current situation. All right, for Paul Fritschner, I appreciate all you guys for listening. If you have not subscribed to Musketeer Report yet, go there. Please do that now. Join the best online community of Xavier fans anywhere on the internet, and we'll talk more about it on the message board.